trip to visit a couple of friends I had studied with in high school. They had moved to the city of Berkeley to study at the University of California, and since then, every summer I traveled there to visit them and spend the time with them. Since we studied together all through high school, and we are practically like brothers, this is a trip I usually take by plane, but last year I drove because there were several places along the way that I really wanted to visit, including parks, museums, and historical sites that I wanted to see. I left early the day to have time to visit these sites, as doing the whole trip would take me a few days, and I wanted to make the best use of the time. The first 2 days of the trip went pretty well and were completely normal, but on the third day, I expected to have arrived at my destination, and instead I was still driving in the middle of the night. It was probably between 9 to 10 p.m. by this time. The road was very quiet, and there wasn't much traffic, which was very pleasant, if a little unsettling, as I've always been a little afraid of desolate roads. I still had a few hours to go, and I was really looking forward to getting to my friend's house as soon as possible, but I needed to go to the bathroom and have a coffee to wake up a bit, so I stopped at the next exit, where there was a rest stop on the side of the road. This one was quite small, nothing to do with those big rest stops that have parking for trucks and a gas station next to them. This one was just a small building with a row of parking in front of it, but I didn't need more than that, so it fit me like a glove. As soon as I arrived, I noticed that it was quite dark, and there didn't seem to be anyone else, so I parked my car and started walking towards the building. I took my time and stopped to stretch my body a bit, as I had been driving for several hours and was starting to feel all my muscles numb. Once in the building, I looked around and saw that there was a hallway with a janitor's closet and a men's restroom on one side and a women's restroom on the other. There were also a couple of vending machines and a rack with magazines. I looked at one of the vending machines for a moment, looking for some energy drink, then turned around and noticed a car that had pulled into the rest stop and parked right next to mine. I found this a bit odd, with all the other open spaces. Why park right next to my car? I tried not to make a big deal out of it and went into the restroom, did what I had to do, and came out in about 5 minutes. And as I did, I noticed that the car was still parked right next to mine and had the lights on, so it looked as if the driver was still inside. This made me wonder what the driver was doing, but overall, it didn't seem like much. So I looked around and my attention went back to the vending machine. I decided to buy a Red Bull, and as I drank it, I couldn't help but turn my attention back to the car parked next to mine. For some reason, there was something I didn't like. When I looked back towards my car, I noticed that the car next to mine was still running. I started to walk to get out, but just a few meters from the door, I heard the engine of the car turn off, and a second later, the driver's door opened, and a tall bearded man came out, wearing a brown leather jacket with both hands in his pockets. I stopped where I was near the door, and the man started walking towards me. Suddenly, I felt my body fill with tension, and there was something about this guy that definitely gave me a bad feeling. However, I kept calm and tried to look calm, but the truth is that I was quite nervous, especially because of the fact that his eyes were fixed on me, and they really seemed malicious. When I was only a few meters away, I moved from the door and started walking in the direction of my car. And at one point, we inevitably passed each other. I greeted him with a nod, and he did the same, but when I took a couple of steps forward, I heard when this man called me back with a hey. At that moment, I turned around, only to find myself face to face with the barrel of a 9mm pistol pointed right at my face, and the man's macabre smile. "Why are you in such a hurry?" he asked me as I struggled to control my breathing, which was getting faster and faster. I raised my hands as a sign that I was not resisting, and asked him what he wanted, to which he answered bluntly, "Give me your watch, your wallet, and your cell phone." I obeyed his request without a hint, thinking that that was all, and now he would let me go. But after giving him everything he asked for, he motioned with his head for me to accompany him. But instead of entering the store, he made me walk to the back where the forest was, and we entered the forest. At that moment, my heart was pounding, because I was sure that if he only wanted to rob me, he would have let me go. But instead, he was leading me into this forest, which clearly showed that he had another intention. I was sure that for some reason, he wanted to kill me. As I was walking towards the place, I asked him why he was leading me there, and he just said walk. I was really scared and begged him to please let me go. I told him to take my card if he wanted to, but he wouldn't say anything. When we had walked about 15 or 20 meters into the forest, he asked me to stop and turn around. I did as he asked, and we were face to face. He was only about 2 meters away from me. Then he pointed his gun right at my face, and I knew it was the end of me. I was going to die there. inside a forest in the middle of nowhere. The only thing I could think about was the suffering of my parents when the news reached them. At that moment, I could feel the tears running down my face and every fiber of my body trembling, while this wretch looked at me with eyes full of evil. He asked me to kneel down, and I did, knowing that these were my last moments of life. I closed my eyes tightly, waiting for the shot, and then it happened. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots in a row. I covered my ears with my hands and screamed with each burst, falling on my face to the ground, crying and in absolute panic. I'm dead, I thought, but I felt nothing. No pain, no sign of being hurt, just the most intense feeling of terror I have ever experienced in my life. A fear so deep I could feel it in my bones. That's when I heard his laughter. The guy was guffawing as if someone had told him the funniest joke. In the end, don't forget to wash your pants. Then he turned around and walked away laughing like it was nothing. I started touching myself, looking for any wounds, and there were none. And then I knew he hadn't shot me. I don't think I can describe what I felt at that moment. It was a mixture of terror, joy at being alive and unharmed, and a deep sense of humiliation. It was a mix of emotions that I couldn't process. So I stayed right where I was for a few minutes, while I heard the engine of the guy's car start and then drive away. Only then did I gather the strength to stand up and walk back to my car. But first, I went back into the building and washed my face in the bathroom. Looking in the mirror, I could see that my condition was terrible. My face was red and swollen and covered with a sticky mixture of tears and mucus. I was grateful to be alive, but I also felt deeply humiliated and dejected, while my body was still shaking uncontrollably. I guess I was still in the midst of some kind of nervous shock. After a few minutes, I left the store and drove to the nearest town. There I was able to borrow a phone and called the police. Later, I told the officers what had happened to me and gave them a detailed description of the guy. That night, I rented a room in the town and spent the night there. The next day, feeling a little better, I continued on my way, but without stopping anywhere. I just drove straight to my friend's house. Once there, I told them what had happened to me, and they couldn't believe it, nor could they believe how close I came to dying that night. I stayed at my friend's house for a couple of weeks, as I do every year, and during that period, I tried to appear as normal as possible, but deep down I was very shocked, and that shock didn't go away for months and even today. When I look back on that experience, I experience again the same emotions that overwhelmed me today. I never knew anything about the guy who robbed me and almost killed me, so I don't know if they managed to catch him, or he's still out there terrorizing people. I just went on with my life, but yes, I never stopped at a rest stop since then. Hello, my name is Dan, and I have been driving a truck for over 25 years for a living. The story I'm going to tell you today happened about 3 years ago, and it's something that marked my life forever. It was a rainy night, and I was driving my huge truck on the highway, which by that time was completely deserted. Since it was 4 o'clock in the morning, I was 4 hours away from arriving at the company's warehouse, where I had to deliver a shipment of industrial supplies, when a torrential rain that seemed to come out of nowhere began to fall. This made visibility difficult on the road, but after so many years practicing this profession, I can say that I am quite used to driving in these conditions and for long hours, although that did not prevent me from being annoyed at the thought that the rain would delay me the whole trip. However, the downpour was not the only thing that caused me discomfort that night for some unknown reason. Since I entered that last stretch of road, a strange restlessness began to take over my body. I could not describe exactly what it was. I just know that something felt strange. Maybe it was the eerie silence that surrounded me, or the fact of having many hours driving without rest. What is certain is that I could not get rid of that feeling that something was not right. I tried to push it aside by putting some music on the radio, and it certainly helped to distract my mind a bit, but the strange restlessness never went away. I kept driving despite the poor visibility, but I slowed down to have maneuverability in case of any unforeseen events. It's a precaution I always take when driving in the rain. However, a few kilometers ahead, something very unexpected happened. The rain was still falling with intensity while the fog was getting thicker. However, I could see through the fog the lights of a car that seemed to be coming at full speed in the opposite direction and was heading directly towards me. Due to the thick fog, it was impossible for me to see it until it was practically on top of my truck. I immediately and reflexively turned the steering wheel to try to avoid it at the last second, but in doing so, due to the moisture on the road, it became impossible for me to regain control of the truck, and no matter how hard I struggled to stabilize it, I ended up flipping violently and spinning off the road. The last thing I remember was the sensation of weightlessness as the truck spun, and the thunderous noise of the pan to the overturn. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, and everything was a blur. My head throbbed with pain and my body felt heavy. I tried to move, but could not, and soon realized that I was severely injured and could not move my legs. In shock, as I tried to remember what had just happened, eventually it all came back to me. The car ramming me trying to ride the truck overturning, the noise, the banging, the pain, and now me, lying in the middle of nowhere, injured and alone. I tried to call for help, but my voice was very weak. I could barely make a sound. I was trapped in the rubble, and I didn't know how long I would survive as I lay there struggling to keep my eyes open. I mustered all the strength I had left to try to shout for help, but it was no use, because at that moment I began to hear footsteps approaching, and in the distance I managed to distinguish the sound of an engine running. A few moments later, an older man approached me together with a younger one. They were a father and his son. They helped me and called an ambulance. At times, I could feel my consciousness fading, but I held on as long as I could, knowing that help was on the way. Finally, the ambulance arrived, and I was rushed to the hospital. On the way, I was in and out of consciousness, but I remember the doctors telling me that I had several broken bones, internal bleeding, and a severe head injury. They also said I was lucky to be alive. I couldn't believe it. I had been in a near-fatal accident, and I had no idea how I was going to recover from that, or if I really would, because judging from what the doctors were saying, it was possible that these were my last moments in this world. Fortunately, I did not die, but the recovery process was so torturous that at times it made me wish it had been. Days turned into weeks, and I was still in the hospital trying to heal from my injuries. I could not move and was completely dependent on the nurses and doctors. I had never felt so helpless in my life. But as the days went by, I began to notice strange things happening around me. There were times when I would wake up in the middle of the night, and I could feel someone watching me. At first I thought it was just me because of the brain damage or some injury done to my brain, but the more it happened, the more I began to believe that something was not right. One night, as I was lying in my hospital bed, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a tall, dark figure, but I couldn't make out his features. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. Meanwhile, the figure began to approach me. I tried to move, but I couldn't. It was absolutely desperate and terrifying. The figure kept coming closer until I could feel its cold breath right on my face. I closed my eyes tightly and began to pray. I was so terrified that I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I stayed like that for a few minutes until I finally opened my eyes, and then I realized he was gone. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when the nurses came in the morning, I told them what had happened, but they dismissed it by saying that it was a simple sleep paralysis episode, which could be a consequence of my brain injury and the stress of the whole situation. But I disagreed. I was convinced that what I had seen was completely real and not a hallucination, as they wanted to make it look like. From that day on, I began to see the figure more frequently, everywhere and at any time of the day. Perhaps you might think that as the days went by I got used to it, but I didn't. It was absolutely terrifying every time, and it was driving me crazy. However, I didn't say anything about it again. Instead, I started researching on the internet, as I was somehow sure that this figure had something to do with the accident. It was then that I discovered that on that particular stretch of road, there had been many accidents similar to the one I had, and many of the victims claimed to have experienced strange occurrences. Some talked about seeing the lights of a car ramming them, while others had claimed to have seen a figure in the middle of the road that caused them to have the accident. At that moment, I knew that I was not alone in my experience, and that indeed that figure that seemed to be stalking me day and night was the reason for my accident. I was afraid, but I was also angry. I wanted to know what has happened to me. I wanted to know who or what that figure was and why it was chasing me. But first I had to make sure that this was really the case. The man who stopped to help me that day with his son, his name was William. He accompanied me to the hospital and told my family, and before he left me his phone number, saying that I could count on him if I ever needed him. I could not be more grateful. I couldn't be more grateful, as he and his son were my guardian angels that night. But I remembered that he arrived on the scene almost immediately, which means he was coming very close to me when it all happened, which means he must have also seen the car coming at full speed in the opposite direction. That afternoon, I called him and asked him about it, and his answer simply corroborated what I already suspected, and that is that he had not seen any other car. He told me that at the time of the accident, he was coming a few meters behind my truck, when he suddenly noticed that the truck turned left abruptly and started zigzagging until it finally went off the road and started spinning. But he assured me that there was never a car driving in the opposite direction, and that in fact no other car passed by until the ambulance arrived. Although I already suspected that something like this is what had really happened to me, the fact that William confirmed it really sent chills down my spine, as this figure, that ghost or whatever it was, almost caused me to lose my life. as happened to several of the drivers who encountered it or the ghost car before me. But the strangest thing happened that same night later at about 11 p.m. And that same day, the figure appeared again at the foot of my bed and once again began to approach, until it positioned itself next to me, but this time it did not disappear but began to whisper words to me. It began to tell me its story. The figure began to tell me that he was a truck driver who had died in an accident on that stretch of road many years ago. He told me he was driving his truck in the middle of a night, just as dark and rainy as the one when suddenly out of nowhere came a car coming the other way, but unlike me, he couldn't avoid it. So they collided head-on, and no one survived. I frowned, and just as I was about to ask him who he was, a nurse opened the door and came over to give me my treatment for that night. But was the last time a figure appeared in front of me. Since then I never saw her again. The next day, I began to research about the accidents in that area, and after several hours of searching, I came across a news item from 35 years ago, where it was reported about a fatal crash on that highway in which the driver of a sedan car, who was under the influence of alcohol, drove the wrong way on the highway and collided head-on with a cargo truck, and both drivers lost their lives instantly. However, there were no details about the drivers involved in the accident. When I saw this news, I realized that that night it was not really the spirit of the truck driver who caused my accident as I thought, but the spirit of the driver of the other car. But what I found saddest of all is the fact that probably these two souls were trapped in that moment, unable to transcend. Since then, every chance I get, I say a prayer for both of them, that they may finally find their way to eternal rest. My name is Eloy, and all this happened in August 2008. I remember it as clear as if it were yesterday. It was one of the hottest summers we had had in years, and I was behind the wheel of my old cargo truck, where I was hauling a load of steel sheets, which were to be used in a construction site in southern Missouri. By then I had over 20 years of truck driving, and I honestly thought I had seen it all, but what happened that day to this day haunts me. I drove down Highway 60 on some stretch of road through the Mark Twain National Forest, a really beautiful place during the day, but very desolate and scary at night. I was making good time record and planned to stop at a truck stop that is near Springfield to go to the restroom and get something to eat and maybe get some sleep before continuing on my route. However, a few miles before arriving at said stop, I came across an old beat-up truck parked on the side of the road with its hood up, and as I was approaching it, I see a chubby guy start waving his arms at me. We truck drivers have an unspoken code, and that is that we always help each other. So I slowed down, parked a little further ahead, and approached him to see what was going on and tried to help him. The man was about 45 years old, and he was wearing a baseball flannel that was supposed to be white, but it was completely stained with grease. Just like his face and hands, it was evident that he had been working on the truck for quite some time, maybe all day. By this time the sun was going down, and before I got to where I was, he started walking towards me. "Thank God you stopped," he said, looking quite relieved. He shook my hand and told me his name was Neil, and then explained that he had been stranded there for about 4 or 5 hours, and that apparently the car had a damaged alternator. So he asked me if I could take it to the nearest town to spend the night there and see if in the morning he could find the part and a mechanic he could bring with him. I looked him up and down, and after sizing him up for a few moments, he seemed like a harmless guy, so I didn't have the heart to leave him stranded there. After all, the next town was 20 miles down the road. Neil went back to his truck, grabbed a small duffel bag, and climbed into the passenger seat of mine, and then we were on our way. Neil was a pretty chatty guy. He commented to me that he was from Alabama and was on his way to pick up a load in St. Louis. He also told me that his old truck had been giving him trouble for weeks, but he thought he could make it farther. When we were about 15 to 20 minutes down the road, I noticed a couple of cars in my rearview mirror. They were coming one behind the other and following us pretty close. At first, I didn't pay any attention to them. I thought maybe they were a couple of impatient drivers who wanted to overtake me, but both cars stayed behind us, which was quite strange considering that we were the only vehicles on the road at the time. Starting to get nervous, I asked Neil if he knew them, pointing my head towards the rearview mirror. Then he turned to look and told me he had never seen them before. I joked with him, asking if he was running from someone, and he laughed a little nervously, saying nothing of the sort, but I noticed his voice was shaking, which let me know he was a little nervous. I couldn't judge him, though, as I was getting nervous too. The pair of cars following us from that moment on, I kept an eye on these cars. They followed us for about 10 miles, and not once did they try to pass us. That was too suspicious, but when we got to a stretch where we had woods on both sides of the road, they finally made their move. Both cars accelerated, and after passing us they turned and crossed the road, closing us off completely, which forced me to brake hard. "What the hell?" I said out loud. The car stopped dead in front of us, and 3 guys got out of them, all armed, and walked straight towards my truck. My heart started pounding, and as I looked to my side, I noticed that Neil was pale and sweating profusely. I whispered to him to try to stay calm and reached under my seat, only to realize that I had left my gun in the house. Before I left, recently the company I worked for had decided to crack down on drivers carrying guns, which is why on my last few trips I didn't carry it with me. The guys came up to my truck and themselves at both doors pointing guns at us, and one of the guys ordered us to get out once again. I looked at Neil, who looked like he was going to pass out at any moment, and told the guys I didn't want any trouble, raising my hands in surrender. I told them they could take whatever they wanted, but then the same guy repeated to us to get off the truck, but this time in a more aggressive. Well, of course we did as we were told. We slowly got off the truck, and as we were doing so, Neil tripped and almost fell. Another one of the guys instructed us to move to the side of the road, keeping the gun pointed at us, then ordered us to empty our pockets, and we handed him our wallets, phones, and keys. "You can take the truck if you want," I said. "Just let us go." "Shut up," he snapped. He subsequently took our stuff and threw it into one of the cars, then walked back towards us, while the other two were still pointing at us, and then threw the keys to the truck back to me and gestured for me to get in and started. I looked at Neil again, who looked as confused as I was. Then the guy told me for my own sake and my friends not to try anything. I went back to the car with one of the guys pointing at me, turned the key, and the engine started roaring. Then the other guy motioned for Neil to get into one of the cars. The guy pointing at Neil, who appeared to be the ringleader, ordered that he be in one of the cars, and I was in the truck. I had no idea what his plan was, but I wasn't about to argue with a gun, so I started driving again, following the car, where Neil was riding along with two of the guys, while the other guy came up behind. We drove for what seemed like hours, although it was probably only about 20 minutes at most. The guys took us down a fairly narrow dirt road that led off the highway and much deeper into the forest. My mind inevitably began to search for escape routes, but it was useless. I had no way out, and even if there was, I would not leave poor Neil at the mercy of those guys, as they would probably retaliate against him. It was a very complicated situation. The trees closed in around us, and I knew we were heading into a trap. Finally, the car stopped in a small clearing in the woods, and the guys got out, still holding their guns, and motioned for me to get out of the truck. I got out of the cab with my hands shaking and my heart racing. If they had brought us this far, I was sure it wasn't for anything good. Well, I thought if they had wanted to just rob us, they would have gone on the road and left with our belongings in the truck, no problem. The ringleader motioned for me to follow him into the woods, where Neil was already being led by another of the crooks. This one was a short, rather stocky guy with a truly devilish look on his face, which he turned to me in a moment and gave a very macabre half smile. We walked for a few minutes until we came to an old abandoned cabin. My insides twisted with fear when I saw it. The guys pushed us inside, and I noticed that there were only a couple of old pieces of furniture and a lot of garbage. They ordered us to sit on the old dusty couch. "What do you want to?" asked the guy, who seemed to be the boss, trying to keep my voice steady. Then the guy with the devilish look smiled again in the creepy way and told me, "Just make sure you don't go running to the police." Then he turned to his companions, who also started laughing, and then he started to tie our hands and feet. I felt a cold sweat run down my body when the third guy said in a mocking tone, "Don't go anywhere," and they all started laughing. But after that they left the cabin, closing the door immediately after they left. I began to struggle to loosen the ropes and told Neil that we had to get out of there. He, who was pale and shaking uncontrollably, said to me in a cracked, almost whispered voice, "They're going to kill us, aren't they too?" Which I replied, "No, if we make it out first," trying to sound confident without my voice giving away how scared I was too. I moved my wrists, trying to loosen the knots as fast as I could. It was slow and painful work, but I could feel the rope starting to give way. At that moment, we heard the car start up and drive away, leaving us alone, wrapped in the mysterious silence of the forest. Once I was able to get free of the ropes, I began to untie Neil's hands and feet. "Thanks, buddy," he said to me, his voice cracking and trying to lighten the moment. I said, "Save them for later, when we're really safe," and he nodded his head, and we stumbled out of the cabin and looked around. It was already dark and visibility was very low, but we could tell that the cars were gone, and so was my truck. So Neil asked me if I knew how to get back, and the truth is that at the point we had walked so deep into the woods that I had a very vague idea. But I knew we should walk in the opposite direction of the cabin, and then we would probably find the road. So we didn't finally reach the road, but we began to wonder if it was really a good idea, as we were panicking at the thought that the guys might come back. But if we wanted to get help, we couldn't stay in the woods. So we started walking, keeping to the edge of the road, ready to dive into the trees at the first sign of threat. The sun had set a while ago, projecting, so the only thing we could see was the reflection of the moon on the leaves of the trees. I kept my ears wide open, trying to listen for any car sounds that might be approaching. After what seemed like an eternity, we heard the faint sound of a vehicle approaching. I couldn't help but shiver, thinking it might be our attackers. I hissed at Neil, dragging him into the brush, and we crouched down, holding our breath as the car slowly approached. Then we realized it wasn't any of the cars from earlier, but was an old beat-up sedan, and the driver looked like a fairly old man, probably someone from around there, making sure it wasn't those guys. I immediately stood up, waving my arms. Hey, hey, we started yelling at the driver, and we saw the car start to slow down until it stopped. The driver rolled down his window and looked at us suspiciously.